Did you know there was once a train that ran above 3rd Avenue? Or that you could grab a real egg cream for 25 cents on nearly every block? New York in the 1960s was electric, chaotic, soulful, and so much of that city. It's gone. Let's remember what we've lost. The trains of 3rd Avenue. There was a time when New York City wasn't just bustling, it was roaring from above. The 3rd Avenue elevated train, fondly known as the L, clattered over the street like an iron dragon. Built in the late 1800s and running through much of the 20th century, by the 1960s, it was a relic and a noisy one at that. You'd walk underneath it and the sunlight would flicker through the steel beams while the rumble of the train overhead drowned out conversations. People living along the L had to yell over the racket. But you know what? It was New York. When it was torn down, it felt like a piece of the city's heartbeat disappeared. Now, if you mention the L to younger New Yorkers, they look at you like you're describing a movie set. But for those of us who remember, it was gritty magic in motion. Candy stores and the egg cream. You couldn't walk 2 blocks in 1960s New York without passing a candy store, a real one, with a soda fountain, a rotating display of penny candy, and that all-important counter where you could order a New York egg cream. Now, for anyone outside the city, let me clear something up. An egg cream had no egg and no cream. Just seltzer, milk, and chocolate syrup. Mixed just right, it was a fizzy, sweet, foamy miracle. And in those days, a small one would cost you 5 or 10 cents. Those candy stores weren't just shops, they were neighborhood hubs. You'd sit at the counter, talk with the owner, and feel like you belonged. And the moment they started disappearing, a part of New York's soul went with them. Peep shows, porn palaces, and Times Square before Disney. Times Square in the 1960s was not for the faint of heart. This was before Broadway was glitz and glamour, before the big LED screens and Disney took over. Times Square back then? It was gritty, neon lit, and a little dangerous. There were peep show booths, seedy theaters showing adult films 24/7, hustlers on corners, and the occasional street preacher shouting at both. It was dirty, loud, and a bit wild, but it also had character. Of course, the city eventually cleaned it up. They tore down the grindhouses, swept out the adult shops, and brought in theme restaurants and tourist-friendly attractions. Street games and neighborhood kids. Before smartphones, before video games, there were stoops and stickball. The 1960s were the golden years of street games in New York. You'd see kids on every block with a broomstick and a pink Spalding ball, playing stickball against the sides of buildings. Ringo Lavio, Johnny on the Pony, Kick the Can. These were serious business. Chalk drawings covered sidewalks, sewer caps became bases, fire hydrants became water parks in July. You didn't schedule playdates, you just shouted down the street and the whole crew came running. If this trip down memory lane brings back good times, I'd really appreciate it if you hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. We've got a lot more stories to share. Local bodegas that felt like family. Back in the 60s, your neighborhood bodega wasn't a chain convenience store with pre-wrapped sandwiches. It was a cultural center. Run by Puerto Rican, Dominican, or Jewish families, these mom-and-pop bodegas knew your name, your regular order, and probably your grandmother's birthday. You could grab a buttered roll, a coffee in a blue Greek cup, a pack of smokes for your uncle, and hear the latest neighborhood gossip while waiting for change. The store cat always had a name. The guy behind the counter was half philosopher, half cashier. It wasn't just about the groceries, it was about connection. Automats. One of the most futuristic feeling things in 1960s New York wasn't a spaceship, it was a restaurant. Welcome to the Automat. Imagine this. Walls lined with small glass windows. Behind each one, a perfectly made sandwich, slice of pie, or piping hot mac and cheese. You'd pop in a nickel, turn the handle, and your meal appeared no lines, no cashier, no waiting. Horn and Hard Arts automats were the crown jewels of fast dining. You'd see everyone there, businessmen in fedoras, kids with pocket change, lonely artists scribbling in notebooks. The food was honest, the coffee was strong, and the windows steamed up in winter like a bakery oven. But by the late 70s, they started to vanish. Fast food chains took over. The personal charm disappeared. Checker cabs and the hailing dance. If you grew up in 1960s New York, you remember the checker cab, big, boxy, and built like a tank. These yellow beasts had legroom for days and doors that closed with a thunk. But what made them iconic wasn't just the design. It was the art of hailing them. There was no app, no Uber, no screen telling you the driver's star rating. You stood on the curb, did the hail dance with one arm up, one eye squinting down the avenue, and hoped the light on top said, "Off duty," after they saw you. Getting a cab in the rain? That was a street survival skill. Inside, the cabbie might talk politics, play jazz on the radio, or tell you his life story between lights. They weren't just drivers, they were part of the city's rhythm. Coney Island before the corporate Polish. Coney Island in the 1960s wasn't sleek or sanitized. It was raw magic on a hot day. You could smell it before you saw it. The salt air mixing with cotton candy, sweat, and Nathan's famous hot dogs sizzling on the grill. The cyclone creaked and rattled like it was about to fall apart, but you rode it anyway, screaming all the way. The boardwalk buzzed with life families with strollers, kids with sticky fingers, street performers, and that one guy selling ice-cold wata out of a dented cart. Shoot the Chute, the Wonder Wheel, the haunted house ride that barely worked but scared you stiff anyway, Milkman and glass bottles on doorsteps. If you were lucky enough to grow up in a New York apartment building or brownstone in the 60s, you might remember waking up to the soft clink of glass milk bottles being delivered, sometimes nestled inside a wire rack, sometimes just waiting neatly by the door. This wasn't just milk, it was a ritual. Creamy, fresh, and often with that thick layer of cream floating at the top. The local milkman was as much a part of the neighborhood as the mail carrier or the corner deli guy. He had a route, he knew your name, and he knew whether you liked whole milk, chocolate, or buttermilk. Kids would sometimes sneak the foil caps off just to peek inside or snag a sip. There was something wholesome, real, and personal about it. And when that quiet tradition faded, replaced by supermarket gallons and plastic jugs, it wasn't just convenience that won. Something warm and neighborly was lost too. Phone booths on every corner. Before cell phones, before text messages and WhatsApp groups, New Yorkers relied on a citywide symphony of phone booths. You'd spot them at every corner, gas station, and train platform, glass-walled, coin-operated capsules of privacy and possibility. You'd step in, close the door, if it still slid, and pull out your folded paper of scribbled phone numbers. Maybe you called your mom to say you'd be late, or dialed a friend just to hear a familiar voice echoing through static. And if you didn't have a dime, you reverse-charged the call. Remember collect calls? You'd rush your entire message into the operator's name prompt. Will you pick me up at Grand Central at 5? They weren't glamorous. They often smelled like cigarette smoke, old gum, or yesterday's rain. But they were lifelines. And when they began disappearing, so did those spontaneous, unplanned connections we used to stumble upon in the middle of a crowded block. Street vendors. In the 1960s, New York street vendors weren't just selling food. They were characters, part of the city's living folklore. You'd see them rolling their heavy carts out in the early morning mist, setting up on corners like Columbus Circle, Union Square, or outside the old Yankee Stadium. These weren't the uniform silver hot dog carts of today. Each vendor had their own setup, their own voice, and their own spin. One might sing show tunes while serving you a niche. Another might yell, "Hot chestnuts, hot pretzels." With enough flair to stop traffic, they knew their regulars. They saw the same cabbies, construction workers, school kids, and retirees every day. Buying a pretzel wasn't just a transaction, it was a conversation, a daily ritual, a moment of warmth between strangers. Subway tokens. Long before tap cards and phone apps, every subway rider in New York had one small, jingling companion in their pocket. The subway token. There was something oddly satisfying about holding one circular solid, sometimes with the iconic Y cut out from the middle. You'd drop it into the turnstile, hear that familiar metallic clunk, and push your way into the beating heart of the city underground. The stations themselves were a different world. Newsstands stacked with tabloids, shoeshine men calling out for customers, the unmistakable smell of wet concrete and roasted peanuts from nearby vendors. Back then, riding the subway felt like joining a gritty, unspoken brotherhood. You read a paperback, you people watched, or you stood silently, shoulder to shoulder, with people from every walk of life. Coal-fired stoves and the winter smell of home. In many older New York tenements and brownstones of the 60s, heating that wasn't a button on the wall that was coal-fired, and sometimes required manual labor. You'd wake up on a cold morning to the deep, earthy smell of burning coal rising through the pipes. Landlords or superintendents would shovel it into roaring furnaces in the basement, and radiators in the apartments would knock, hiss, and eventually bless them begin to warm. Kids would sometimes gather around those hissing radiators like cavemen around a fire. You'd lay your damp gloves or socks across the top and hope you didn't burn them to a crisp. There was a sound to that heat, a metallic groan, a burst of steam, and a smell that's never quite been replicated. Radios on windowsills. Walk down any block in New York during the summer of the 1960s and you'd hear it not from inside a store or a phone, but from a window. Old radios perched on fire escapes or windowsills playing Motown, doo-wop, or the Beatles as the city buzzed below. There were no Bluetooth speakers, just open windows, rustling curtains, and music spilling out like an invitation. It created an unspoken street symphony. One building might be blasting the Supremes, another Frankie Valli. A car would roll by with a Sinatra tune, and someone on a stoop would be humming along. And on warm nights, when the breeze carried those sounds from block to block, it felt like the whole city was singing together. Share your memories in the comments. I read everyone. And if this trip back to 1960s New York touched something in you, please tap that like button, subscribe, and join me next time as we remember what made our past so unforgettable.